Good. Distinctive. How Jesus Christ impacts ordinary people. That's the theme of our Sunday talks at the moment, and we're looking at the Gospel of John. And just to add a bit of spice to life, as you're probably well aware, we're going to go through the Gospel of John backwards. Some bright spark did suggest to me this morning that we ought to sing all our songs backwards just to make the point, but I just think that would be too confusing, even for a bear of a small brain like me. And so we're looking at the Gospel of John, and we started last week by talking about how it came about that John wrote this book. And we said that this book is a gospel, so it's history, because he was there, he saw it happen, but it's history with a motive. I've written this stuff down so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. Now, what single event points us to Jesus being the Christ? There are many, and that's why John wrote his book. But if there's one single event that points to Jesus being God in human form, it is the resurrection that we read about this morning. And normally we'd look at this at Easter time. And this is a great opportunity for us to consider the significance of the resurrection aside from the normal time when we do it in the church calendar. Because one of the main ways in which the Bible interprets the resurrection is that through it we have good news to communicate to the world. I don't know whether you've ever seen the sort of satirical news program, Have I Got News for You? Today, have I got good news for you? Have I got news for you? It's quite a laugh, really, if you get a chance to watch it. It's worth the idle watch. And what they do, however, is they take news, facts, and they reinterpret them, they play with them. And I mean, these people are all well able to ad-lib about the kind of stuff that goes on in the world. And sometimes it's hilariously funny, sometimes a bit borderline, but most of the time hilariously funny. So do give it a watch if you want. But what fascinates me is they take the facts and they reinterpret them. Now what we're seeking to do here is simply to take the facts and believe them. And that's what John is all about. He's not about trying to convince us something against our better judgment. He's saying, just look at the evidence. And the way in which the resurrection time and time again is interpreted in the New Testament is that it is the route through which freedom comes to ordinary people like you and me. Freedom from sin, freedom from many of the things that burden and bind us, and we'll look at some of those a bit later on. I'd like you to watch a short video clip. We're going to need to take the narrator at the end there. He said, "That wonderful music made the walls dissolve, and for a few brief moments, every last man in Shawshank felt free." Freedom is much more than the absence of confinement. And the kind of freedom that Jesus brought when he rose from the dead was not a political freedom to organise things as we like. It wasn't a religious freedom to believe whatever we want. It wasn't a social freedom to do whatever we want. It was a spiritual freedom. That at the deepest point in human life, there is freedom and joy and peace with God. And those men in the film had committed crimes for which they were paying the legal penalty. And we know, we've all said and done things at some point in our lives that have violated God's perfect plan for us. There is a penalty to be paid. And what Jesus achieved when he rose from the dead on the first Easter was genuine forgiveness and freedom. Freedom from the crimes we have committed in God's eyes and for which he paid the ultimate penalty. Those prisoners just got a moment's freedom because of Mozart. Wonderful music. I love playing Mozart when I get the chance. But Christ brings complete and timeless freedom because he's paid my price. And that's what we're exploring this morning. That's why we've got good news to take to a watching world. And I'm thrilled with the church because when somebody's looking for spiritual security or spiritual solutions in life, you can bring them into church, and you don't have to try and convince them against their better judgment. All I have to do is say, look around you, because what you see is what you get. These people, most of us here this morning, have had a deep experience of Christ. And while we're ordinary human people and sometimes we mess up, nevertheless, at our heart, there is a love for Christ that changes us from the moment it begins. And as we continue to trust in Christ right through to when we see him face to face. That is the Easter agenda. Christ, because of the resurrection, brings us freedom, genuine, real freedom. So it's worth asking, what is it that we get freedom from? And I thought it would be good for us to consider one or two contemporary prisons. And let me just highlight some of them here. What about bitterness? I may have been hurt by someone and not able to come to terms with it, and I feel bitter. And any sense of sweetness or joy in my character evaporates when I focus my bitterness on that one person or incident. And who is the loser? I am. Or maybe there's anger, because bitterness is a prison. And anger, particularly anger against another person, is one of the most destructive emotions that we can experience. You know, when we see their name on the email header, we begin to feel cross. Have you noticed that there's a reaction that most of us have when we hear a voicemail? You know, when I hear my wife's voice on the voicemail, I go, yes, that's wonderful, that's Rosie. There may be other people on your voicemail, but when you hear their voice on the voicemail, you go, oh no, not again. And for some of us, when you hear a particular voice, our hackles rise. And when we're angry, we can do all sorts of unrealistic things that with more sober judgment we wouldn't do. There's a little structure in the base of the brain called the amygdala, and it's thought that our emotions are, as it were, packed into there. Every time we feel something, it affects our amygdala ever so slightly. So the amygdala is the one that triggers emotion, the part of the brain that triggers emotion. And if we're not careful, if the amygdala is allowed to take over the cognitive, the thinking part of our brain, we can act and react in ways which in our sober moments we simply wouldn't. I mean, I'm sure you have seen, as I have, a film of a footballer biting another one on the field. Why? Why did Mike Tyson bite Evander, what's his name, Holyfield's ear off, or part of it? Why is it sometimes our anger wells up so much within us that we do things that in our saner moments we wouldn't even contemplate? It's, you know, in terms of the chemistry of the brain, it's because the amygdala hijacks the frontal cortex. You can read all about amygdala hijacks. Google is your friend on that. But we do things when we're angry that otherwise we wouldn't even consider. And I can become confined by deep feelings of annoyance. Anger is a prison. And in being angry, I'm giving the person I'm angry about rent-free access to my head. And then there's unforgiveness. Let's recognize that forgiveness is always painful. Remember, Jesus was being crucified by people whom he deeply, deeply loved. And he said, with pain and compassion, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And God may lead some of us into situations where it is very painful to forgive someone who has hurt us very much indeed. You know, Jesus and Peter had a conversation about this. And I think Peter was saying, you know, should I forgive someone on the third time they offend me? And Jesus said, no, you shouldn't even do it on the 7 or the 70 times 7th. And I heard one chap saying, you wait till the 491st time. let's not forget that when the Lord pinpoints in your heart someone who needs your forgiveness, however costly that may seem, that could be an extremely important moment in your life when God is doing something very precious and potentially wonderful. Unforgiveness is a prison. And these are the things that held Jesus to the cross. And they are the things that he came to bring us freedom from. Am I talking to some Christians this morning who look at that list and you say, oh, yeah, I know, that's me. Can I suggest that you spend some time quietly with the Lord saying, Lord, I want you to help me to find release from my bitterness. I want to do things that show that I'm not angry anymore. I want to forgive. And as we do that, God's Holy Spirit, which, as Elizabeth was reminding us earlier on, is present within all Christian believers, begins to have free rein in us. And once again we find peace and joy in knowing Christ. Well, when it came to the resurrection itself, I noticed here a fascinating little comment. The other disciple, in chapter 20, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed, but they still didn't understand from the scriptures that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So, interestingly, he believed that Jesus was alive, but he didn't understand it. Yes, that was to come later. Don't you find that fascinating? And when it comes to looking at the resurrection, we have to take on board that these Gospels, all four of them, were simply historic accounts of what happened. They're free from the sort of exaggeration or embellishment that we find in some of the so-called apocryphal Gospels. And the reason why they're apocryphal is because there is a lot of exaggeration and embellishment, and you can tell it just from the text. These four that we have here, we say we rest our confidence on these four because they don't do that. They just tell it like it is. So what are the reactions that we find to the resurrection? And we find them both in the Bible and in society today. You see, some people say, I don't believe it. They're the Victor Meldrews of this world. Yeah. I don't believe it. Take Thomas, for example. We considered him last week. Jesus had appeared to the other disciples, but not to Thomas. And so when they said to him, we've seen the Lord, he said, I don't believe it. Because he hadn't yet seen the evidence. And when Jesus came to him and gave him the evidence, took his hands out of his cloak and showed him the nail prints in his hand and invited Thomas to put his hand in the scar on his side, he said, Thomas, you've seen the evidence. Now, rest your life on it. And if you feel, I don't believe it, it could be that you've not yet taken a good look at the evidence. And the evidence is very compelling, both in the Bible and outside of it. And I know it's remarkable, but it's going to be the one thing where God intervenes probably more than anywhere else in the Bible. Now, if the resurrection was just an isolated incident, I think we would probably have written, or someone would have written it up. But it would basically just be a footnote in history. You see, the whole point about the Gospels, and John in particular, is that the resurrection is not just an isolated incident. All the way leading up to the resurrection, there's evidence that God is doing something. Let me give you an example. There are so many examples, and we've said already that John's Gospel is framed around 7 signs. He doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs because they point to who Jesus is. Take Jesus calming the storm, for example. He's in a boat, he's out on the Sea of Galilee, a furious squall blows up, and the people in the boat know very well that they might drown. And Jesus, who is asleep in the boat, gets woken up, and he says, "Master, don't you know that we might drown?" And almost, I don't know whether Jesus did it out of sort of frustration or just, let's get these guys off my back, I want to go back to sleep again. I don't quite know why. Nevertheless, Jesus got up and he spoke to the weather. And using the word that they would use to muzzle an ox or a dog of some sort, he said, "Be quiet, shut up." And instantly the weather calmed down. Now, I don't know, if that had been me in that boat, I know what I would have done. I would have got my mobile phone, I'd have taken a picture of it, and it would be all over Facebook and Twitter. And I'd be going, you know what? That is impressive. Jesus, that is seriously amazing. Is that what the disciples felt? The Gospels tell us that the disciples at that moment were terrified. Now, why is it that they were more terrified of the calm than they were of the storm? Quite simply, because they knew only God could control weather like that. That was their mindset. That's what they knew. And Jesus had just done it. Jesus had just spoken to the storm and it had vanished. So who does that make Jesus? Now that's only one piece of evidence. The Gospels are stacked with it. So that when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of him rising from the dead, we see not an isolated incident, but the climax of a lot of other incidents, each of which point to Jesus being divine, each of which point to Jesus being either just somebody special or the Son of God himself. So my friend, if you're one of those people who says, I just don't believe it, can I encourage you not to believe anything against your better judgment, but take a good look at the evidence, because the evidence points to who Jesus really is. There was a journalist called Frank Morrison. He set out to write a book disproving the resurrection once and for all. And the more he researched it, the more he became aware that even as a journalist, in order to maintain his integrity, he had to believe that it took place. And he ended up writing a book showing the resurrection is true. And it became a bestseller. It's called Who Moved the Stone? You can still buy it. You can get it on your Kindle, actually. And if you're not comfortable with handling that sort of evidence, then just look at the evidence around you. Look at the Christians you know and ask the question, has God changed their lives? And the answer has got to be yes. Some people say, I don't believe it. Some people say, I can't believe it. This would be true of two people walking to a town called Emmaus in the New Testament. It just seemed too incredible. They had heard that Jesus had died, and they couldn't believe that he was alive again. And Jesus came and joined them on the path, incognito. Now, how it was, they didn't recognise him, I'm not sure. We'll just take it as one of the facts of the story. And Jesus took the scriptures and unpacked them, showing these two that the Christ had to die and had to rise again. And it was only when they got to the house and Jesus said grace at a meal that they realised who it was. They said, I can't believe it, until again they saw the evidence. Some people can't believe it because they consider it to be irrelevant. When I trained when I studied theology, and the same was true when I studied mathematics, the big argument was, do you believe that Christ rose from the dead? If you did, then you count yourself as a Christian, and if you didn't, then you wouldn't. And it was a big debate. It was a big issue that we were talking about, and we would talk to other students about, and so on and so forth. Nowadays, the issue is different. It's not so much to do with evidence, because we live in a post-truth age. It's to do with, does it work for me? A much more slippery concept. But life is peppered with examples of little things that we thought were irrelevant that actually turn out to be of vital importance. On the 30th of September 1928, a little-known Scottish scientist left a petri dish on his window ledge and went off on holiday. When he returned, it had gone mouldy, and he nearly threw it out. He nearly said, "This is irrelevant," when he took a second look. And he noticed the telltale signs of the bacteria he was supposed to have been culturing were absent. And Alexander Fleming had just discovered penicillin. And every antibiotic we use today stems from that discovery. You see, if it's true that Jesus is alive and he rose from the dead, then the consequences are far-reaching and life-changing. Some people say I don't, some people say I can't, some people say I won't believe it. This was the priests in the Bible. They would not believe who Jesus was. And in part, they wouldn't believe who Jesus was because they feared they would lose their reputation. And some of us may fear that we might lose our reputation if we come to Christ and follow him. Because it might mean changes in the way that I act or behave, the things I say. But hey, hang on a sec. What's your reputation worth in comparison to your eternal destiny? Beware a decision not to believe, because it can backfire on you very catastrophically. And if this is you, I would urge you to put a question mark over your decision not to believe. And then finally, there are one or two people who say, well, I might believe it. Agrippa was one of those. King Agrippa was somebody who heard Paul talk about his faith, and he said, yeah, you nearly persuade me. Do you know there was a man in the local authority who came to a Christmas service a few years ago, and he came up to me afterwards in the coffee. Coffee in one hand, mince pie in the other. And he said to me, Ian, he said, you nearly convinced me tonight. And instantly the thought went through my mind, Agrippa. And I've been praying for him ever since. I don't know whether God's ever caught up with him. I do hope so. Bernard Levin was talking about becoming a Christian. He said, some of us hover on the edge of the swimming pool, simultaneously longing and fearing to jump. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And if he was right, just if he was right, and I believe he was, there can be nothing more important than our response to him. Jim Elliot, one of the men who died for his faith at the hands of the Auca Indians in the 1950s, wrote this in his journal. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And finally, there are people who do believe it, and I'm one of those. And that was Thomas. Having seen the evidence, he said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Now, I don't know where you stand in relation to all this. I expect most of us today are quite content and happy with believing the resurrection is true. It is, however, quite incredible. Many of you will know that a few years ago, Rosie and I lost our daughter. It would be like her turning up in church today. I don't quite know how I'd handle that. And that was the sort of thought pattern that the disciples went through. Someone whom we'd seen dead, seen buried, brought back to life. I believe it. Because of the evidence and because of the impact and because of the effect of it. I have a friend, not in this church, in one of my previous churches, who very successful businessman, and he spoke to me about how he became a Christian, and he said he had everything going for him, everything. Materially in this world he had nothing that he needed really, but he still felt empty until he trusted Christ, believed in the resurrection, and gave his life to him. that's you this morning, my friend, can I suggest to you, spend some time, I'm going to lead you in a prayer in a moment, just saying to the Lord, would you come on board with me? I believe in the resurrection as best I can. I've looked at the evidence and I believe you. And then see what he does in your life. Let's bow our heads in prayer.